The story of Israel, I think anyway, begins in the book of Exodus, where we are told that the Israelites are in the midst of their worst time in history. They are slaves in Egypt. They groan and cry out. They're forced into labor that, well, is not only dehumanizing, but probably ends up in many deaths. It is there in that place of slavery and the deepest, darkest place of oppression that they cry out to God. Some of them must have thought that God didn't hear their cries because slavery didn't change the minute that they cried out. It took a while for them to realize that they needed somebody to lead them, not just God, but somebody physically. Because you see, the one who had put them into the slavery and oppression was none other than Pharaoh himself. Remember the Ten Commandments, Yul Brynner? That's how I always vision Pharaoh. Hard to imagine somebody with hair being Pharaoh, but in any event, they needed somebody to talk to Pharaoh because the slavery and oppression they experienced was the result of Pharaoh and Pharaoh's grand design to build this marvelous, wonderful, world-encompassing empire. And so at the risk of human dignity and at the degradation of the human community that was building his massive public works, Pharaoh needed to be talked to directly by somebody who had the ability to speak the truth. As we know, right? The important role of speaking truth to power. Lo and behold, somebody whose story is told in the midst of time comes along. Because of his encounter with the divine on the mountain, Moses appears in the story of Israel. As time will go on, Moses is considered the first prophet, the greatest prophet, the one who all prophets look to first for their own ministry of being a prophet amongst the people. Moses speaks truth to power. He gives Pharaoh an out. Let the people go, he says, and you can go on your way and we will go on our way. Let the people go. The story is told, though, Pharaoh's heart becomes hardened. Why would you want to get rid of your cheap workforce? Why would you want to get rid of the very people who are building your empire? No, give them harder work to do, more work to do. And so while Moses is speaking to Pharaoh, the people are in suffering even more. The book of Exodus says that as the people cried out, and this is an insight that we the readers get that maybe the people in the story don't get, is it says this: God heard their cries, God knew their suffering, God was in the midst of that suffering with them, and at that point, in a sense, decided for their liberation and freedom. Moses becomes the voice of God's liberation and freedom. And you know how the rest of the story goes at that point. They eventually end up in the middle of the desert, in that place of wilderness, where there are hardly any distractions at all. And so in that encounter at the mountain of Sinai, Moses and God speak to one another with such words that, well, we really don't know what they said, other than God gives Moses what comes to be called commandments, 10 commandments, in fact. Unfortunately, again, over time, those commandments become words more than an understanding. And here's the catch. As Moses begins this journey, the mountain, God says to Moses, if you listen to my voice, most translations say it this way, and keep my commandments, then you will be a holy people, a chosen people for me. The actual Hebrew text says, if you listen to my voice, I really listen to my voice, then you will be my chosen, my holy people. Meaning that God is saying to Israel, to Moses, and to subsequent generations, that you don't just listen with your ears, that you listen with your whole person, your whole body, every part of who you are. And in other words, these commandments and the life that is lived after them is to involve the whole person. It's a way of life, not an obedience to a law, but rather a way of life. That's what leads to being the chosen, the holy people. So that when, as you live this way of life according to these words, you will understand that there can only be one focus for you: God, God's character, God's presence. And I always think of it this way: as Moses and God have this struggle with each other, God says to Moses, "This is who I am, slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love." That's the kind of God I am. Oh, and by the way, if you want to be holy, then you have to also be slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. You see how it's a way of life, not an observance of laws or commands or rules. In other words, holiness involves not following laws, but rather living the example of God for the world. That's why they are the chosen one. Of all the peoples of the earth who all belong to God, God says, you are the ones who I am expecting an example of. You are to be the witness to the world of what it means to live as an example, to live in this way of life that I'll call Torah way of life. It shouldn't surprise us then that as Matthew begins to tell this story today, the first verse says this: "And Jesus went up on a mountain." You can't help but think that what Matthew is trying to do is to remind his Jewish audience, struggling with its commitments to be Jews, but also struggling with how they are to be followers of Jesus. You can't help think, but it's not intentional on Matthew's part to liken what Jesus is about to say and do to what Moses was, said, and did. Moses went up a mountain. Jesus goes up a mountain. In other words, that what follows from that point is, well, I'm going to say it, new Torah. I don't think that's what Amy Jill Levine would say, new Torah, because it's not different from, but rather new in this way. Because what prophets understood, and you see, it's without a doubt that Jesus here is understood as a prophet, like Moses. That what prophets realize, that if something dramatic doesn't happen, people will just accept, tolerate, become numb to oppression and slavery. I have to imagine that back there in Egypt, there were probably slaves who just, and I know this to be true, slaves who just simply expected that the norm would always be slavery. I know that to be true because when they're wandering out in the desert and couldn't take directions from anybody, that they cry out, "Would that we had stayed back there. At least we had a roof over our head and food on the table, albeit it was hard, cruel, terrible life, but at least we had something to go on." Meaning that they had become numb to the injustice and to tolerate the slavery and oppression and the harshness laid upon them by Pharaoh and his empire. So something dramatic, the prophets understood, has to not just be said, but something dramatic has to happen. What's interesting is Matthew tells the story is that when Jesus goes up the mountain, and the text didn't quite suggest it this way, but this is how it really is intended to be understood. That Jesus sits down and his disciples gather around him. Meaning they're not standing there out there, Jesus here, like up on a pulpit, preaching to them. But rather they're invited to enter into, well, as Pat suggested to the children, into a relationship, a connection. That the vine and the branches, maybe that's why the branches die, because they're not too well connected to the vine. But here, as they gather around Jesus, much like we try to do here for the union table, that they're invited into a relationship, see, a way of life. A relationship, not only with Jesus, but with each other. That's a different way of thinking about reality. Being in relationship, not just with the teacher, but being in relationship with each other. Why is that going to be important? We'll see. As Jesus begins to speak, and here's what's very interesting. Quite a number of years ago, I don't know why I got to watching it, but if you all remember The Hour of Power, Robert Schuller, he took on these words out of Matthew and called them the Be Happy Attitudes. Remember that? I went one time to the Crystal Cathedral because I just wanted to see what that was all about, right? Magnificent organ and choir beyond imagination. Unfortunately, his son preached, so I was very disappointed. That's why his son didn't last very long as head of the Crystal Cathedral in our hour, because he was a terrible preacher. And on top of it, they didn't have communion, and so I left totally unsatisfied. It was great words, but no communion. So anyway, I was still a Catholic then, so that gives you a clue why I was there. I don't know. I didn't really look like all the rest of the crowd because I was traveling, and so had shorts on and a t-shirt on. Oh, anyway, that's another story. You see, when he talked about the be happy attitudes, you have to understand that any of these words can get perverted, meaning they can get twisted into supporting, well, people like Pharaoh. Because you see, the be happy attitudes was really a part of the whole scope that goes way there to the prosperity gospel. And you see, the Beatitudes can be, well, we can all imagine, right? When you've been hungry, when you've been grieving, when you've thought yourself to be meek in some way, humble. And you see, we can think that these apply to us. And you see, in that prosperity gospel, it says, the more successful you are, the more prosperous you are, the more powerful you might be, the more prestige that you surround yourself, then it must be evidence that God has blessed you. And so when you are all of those things, you are happy, right? Because God is blessing you. And it shouldn't surprise us of how perverted this becomes, because those kind of people and those kinds of instances often become very attractive to us. We go after those people. I was thinking of it this morning, how many of you have been in contact with somebody who might call themselves a celebrity? And you want to be close to celebrities, right? Rub elbows with them. Why do you want to rub elbows with them? Maybe get a TikTok picture with them or an Instagram picture with them or something like that, because maybe a little of that celebrity will rub off. And then you can go home and say, I could shake hands with whoever. Of course, my childhood thing was going to a restaurant with my grandmother's card club, and well, you'll get it right away. The restaurant was Stan Musial and Biggie's in St. Louis, and I got to meet Stan Musial. Growing up in St. Louis, for St. Louis Cardinal people, you know, Stan Musial was like this. He was the hero. To shake hands was, anyway, you all know those kinds of stories, right? You see how seductive it is? Power, prestige. That's why the phenomenon, not only of podcasts and TikTok, and I have nothing against those things, But you see, what it does is it promotes people to a status within the community and society that gives more power and honor and prestige to them, that we all want to be like them. We all want to be with them. We all want to be in their company. And here it is. That's not at all what the Beatitudes are about. Listen again. Happy are those who are poor. Happy are those who are grieving. Happy are those. Would any one of us think that any of those people listed are happy people? No. Would any of us give any of those people the time of day? No. What Jesus is suggesting is that, in contrast to what the norm of society is, that happy people are rich, prosperous, powerful, prestigious, have a lot of charisma, have a lot of ability to push themselves out into the society in such a way that everybody fawns over them. That's what we think happy people are. Jesus is suggesting that here it's quite the opposite. And here's the kick, the prophetic kick. You want to be happy? Then you better start associating with those people. You better start associating with the people at the edges and the margins and the poor and the lost and the grieving and the ones that we don't want to give too much time of day to, the ones that don't get access to the parties and the politics and the power groups. You want to be happy? Associate with them. Put yourself into their position. And you know what's going to happen to that? Do you think that's going to, among all of the friends that you associate with, do you think that's going to make any of your friends very happy? No wonder at the end of this, it says, and blessed are you when they reject you and curse you. How dare you invite that homeless person who smells and is dirty into dinner with you and your family? That's what people are going to say. How dare you to go down to the Central Phoenix, to the Central Arizona shelter for Justice Center downtown? How dare you rub elbows with those people? How many of you come around on iHelp Saturday to visit with the people that are here? Not just to drop off food, but to visit with the people. Now, maybe they don't want to be visited with, but maybe that's because they've been shunned most of their life. Well, that kind of turns the world upside down, doesn't it? So you want to know, as Pat was sharing with the children, the point of being attached to the vine has to do with allowing the very life force of God and the very life force of Jesus to flow in and through you. And the minute that you snip off the branch, it's not going to have that life force. It's going to die. So perhaps happiness has to do with being connected to the life force that allows us to understand that happiness is not what society tells us, but happiness is what the reign of God invites us to consider, and who we invite into our company, and who we share space with. Happy are you when you follow in the footsteps, in the way of the reign of God.